Welcome to the Charlevoix Stories Project, part of the Charlevoix Oral Tradition. Today is March 9, 2016, and we're at the Charlevoix Public Library. My name is David Miles, and our videographer is Rick Pierpont from Pierpont Productions in Harbor Springs, Michigan. We're going to be talking to Marianne and Vince Chu, who were instrumental in building the building that we are currently in. They are former Charlevoix school system teachers, and this is going to be the story of their lives and how they got here. We'll start with Mary Ann. Could you tell us when your family first settled in Michigan and where they came from?
Well, I can. My family came from Scotland, and we've been here for 3 generations. And I found in the Northern Michigan Pioneer book my family, my great-grandfather, and in fact, there's a photograph of my grandmother and my grandfather, great-grandfather and grandmother. And it's also interesting that Vincent's family is in here. This was Andrew Struthers that came.
That's on her mother's side.
That's on my mother's side. And then Vincent's family, Abel Chu, W. Chu, is in this book. Interestingly, we have this book in the Michigan room. This happened to be my grandfather's, but, and on the Michigan room committee, that was one of the books that we preserved, which was kind of fun.
Now, in the Michigan room, you're referring to the Charlevoix Public Library?
Yes, to our library here. So it gives an early history. And it's also interesting that our early relatives were all involved in education in many ways and farming. Vince, tell about your, was it your...
My great-grandfather, Abel Woolston Chu, came here to teach school, bought a farm in 1879. And he had been teaching in Indiana, actually was born in New Jersey, but had been teaching in Indiana, and came in 1979, bought the farm out in Hayes Township, where Maple Grove Road ends at Old 31.
Now, this is just a couple of miles from the Struthers property.
Yes,
So the two families interact.
they knew each other.
And go back
Yeah.
2 generations.
My great-grandparents knew her great-grandparents, and my grandparents knew her grandparents.
And here we met so many years later, and he was in Flint, and I was in Charlevoix, and it was just
And
one
my
of those
father
things.
knew her aunts and uncles and her mother growing up. Sure.
Now, what nationality are you descended from?
English.
So English and Scottish.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And David, I did want to show you the picture of our John R. Struthers, my grandfather, the homestead picture. And there was only one other owner of this property, and that was the Ross family, owned it first. And then my grandfather bought the property in 1909. And then my parents bought the 320-acre farm from John R. Struthers, my grandpa, then in about 1940. And then my father, grew the farm to 1,400 acres eventually.
Now, there's an interaction between the Bosses and the Chews, isn't there?
The Ross. This was Ross.
Oh, Boss.
But yes, there is between the Boss family,
Okay.
Dale Boss's family, because his mother, Iola Boss, was my father's first cousin.
Aha.
His grandfather was Morris Chu, my grandfather's older brother.
Okay. Marianne, can you give us a little description of what it was like to grow up on the farm?
I can. It was a tremendous amount of work. There were 5 children. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. And on a farm, there really isn't a whole lot of playtime. And especially as our farm got larger, there was a lot of work to do. My family did a lot of different things on the farm. We raised sugar beets, for example, as an experimental type of thing. We raised dairy cows for a long time. My mother would be milking up to like 54 cows every morning and every night. And I would have to be helping put silage in the, in front of the cows. So it was always something to be doing. Although I must say, my parents encouraged us to also read after our chores. They encouraged us, with school, and they expected us to all go to college, which all 5 of us did. But work was a priority, and you put in long hours, like when we were baling hay. Even when I was really young, I was, hooking the bales and stacking them, and some of the bales weighed probably almost as much as I did.
You told me once a wonderful story that your grandfather Struthers told you about being
yes.
at the reins of a horse-drawn cart that went across the channel. Can you tell us what he said to you about it?
Well, he did. He was telling about coming in from the farm, and at that time, he had a wagon and a team of horses, and he was getting supplies, and the horses went through the water where our bridge is now.
Which was only 2 feet deep at
Yes,
the time.
which was very shallow, and so he often told that story, and it was hard for us to believe because, of course, in our lifetime, it was always the channel and it was deep.
He probably did it often,
Yes.
Probably
as most
did.
other farmers
But we
had to do.
figured out that he probably did it sometime up to or before 1864. If your grandfather lived to be in his 90s, that would be the range, the age range, so he very easily could have done it.
My grandfather, having to go to Gaylord when he lived on the farm out in Hayes Township in the Model T, and he started up the hill just south of Boyne Falls, and because it was a gravity feed of gasoline to the engine, and the gas tank was in the back, when they started up the hill, it was so steep that the gas would not flow up to the engine, and the car quit. So he had to coast back down the hill, turn around, and back all the way up the hill. Well, he had to go make future trips to Gaylord, and from then on, he always took one of the boys along with a squirt can full of gasoline to sit up on the fender and squirt gasoline into the carburetor so that they could go frontwards up the hill.
And Vince, as you were growing up, what were some of your memories? You left town at a very early age.
Well, no, I was not born in Charlevoix.
Oh, you weren't?
No.
Oh,
My father was born on the farm out in Hayes Township, and when he graduated from Charlevoix High School in 1928, and he and my grandfather did not always see eye to eye about running the farm. And so my father thought after he graduated he would seek his fortune down in Flint. And so he did go to Flint, and he got a job at Fisher Body, which made the GM car bodies at that time. And he didn't write home. And so he started getting homesick about April, and he was thinking, maybe I should be going home and helping Dad plant. And he was, one day he was walking to work along Saginaw Street, which ran alongside the factory, and the people that were waiting to get jobs at Fisher Body were lined up on the sidewalk to go into the employment office. So he was walking facing these people as he went to the factory gate. And there he found his father in line looking for a job. And he's asked him what he was doing there. And he said, well, you left, you weren't happy on the farm. The other kids were too small to help me, and you didn't write, so I sold the farm. So my dad never came back to Charlevoix to live, although growing up we made a lot of trips up here. Mm-hmm. You know, he still had a lot of ties, and his heart was still up here. But he never did come back to live.
that's amazing. Now, it's hard to realize today because we have such easy communication with cell phones, etc., that he should run into his own father not even knowing he had come down from
Right.
northern Michigan. Incredible.
And David, my mother also graduated from Charlevoix, and she was in the class of 1932. And it's interesting, you know, you see this library in the back room, which was the school then.
They were
And-
then 5 years old.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, this library's been so much a part of my life in the school.
Now, where did the Bergs come in? Was your dad part of the community up here?
No, well, he lived in Bel Air. He was born in Bel Air, the Berg family. They were well drillers. And he met my mother at County Normal. They both became teachers. And then my father, decided he didn't care to teach. He wanted to do the farming and business. And my mother then continued on and graduated from Central Michigan University.
Oh, I see.
But she taught in Petoskey for many years.
You have a story about your mother during World War II, and one thing she loved to do, but she couldn't do it because she couldn't.
Oh, yes. The rationing, in the 40s, every family in Charlevoix, had cards that we
Ration
were,
cards.
yes. And for example, shoes and different leather goods, all kinds of items, but especially baking goods. And my mother was a really great cook. She loved to bake. It was nothing for her to make 8, 9 pies, a cake, whatever, bread, all of her own bread. And sugar was such a commodity that was desired. And so she was always trying to finagle how she could get a little bit more sugar.
Did she succeed?
Usually, yes, my mother usually could.
A very determined woman.
She was very determined.
Okay. Well, once you started growing up, working on the farm, but then at a very young age, you came into town and you started to work.
I did, but before I did that, my Aunt Leona Bartlett, which is my mother's sister, worked at Michigan Bell Telephone Company, and she had 2 children, and they rented one of the houses on one of our farms. And so she needed someone to take care of her 2 children. And so I took care of the 2 children when I was in 6th grade, totally all summer long. I cooked, I cleaned, I took care of the 2 children, for like 9, 10 hours a day.
And you were 12 years old.
Yes. So, the work ethic goes back a long time.
I'm certain it
That would have
does.
been Bruce Bartlett,
It-
who owns
it-
a furniture store here in town.
That is my cousin now, that
True.
Bruce.
Yeah. Vince, what did you do in high school? Did you work?
Oh, yeah, I had to work because I was going with her my last year of high school, and I bought a car so that I could drive to Charlevoix and back. Well, then I had to work to support that car. I did a lot of things in the summer. I pushed an ice cream cart up and down the streets, calling out, "Hey, ice cream!" And I would go to the ball games and park my cart and sell ice cream at the ball games in the recreational leagues in town. I bagged groceries at the grocery store. I had an interesting job for about a month one summer. I had to get up at 5 in the morning, ride my bike to Kersley Golf Course. And another friend and I got this job, and we had to take a hose, long garden hose, and run from green to green, take the flag out, drag the hose over the green to get the dew off, put the flag back in, and then run to the next green.
Why wouldn't they wait for the sun to do it?
Well, I guess whoever was their greenskeeper at the time felt that the dew damaged the grass some way. And so I did that for about a month, but I got tired of getting up at 5 in the morning and riding my bike about 4 miles to the golf course and running, and so it didn't last. I looked for other.
Well, you wouldn't have
other work.
survived on a farm then.
Marianne, at a very young age, you started to come into town,
Oh, I did.
and you were a nanny for summer.
Yes,
people.
William Joseph came every summer with his daughter. He was a single parent, and so he had his little girl during the summertime when she was off from school. And so for about 6 years, I took care of her, and I usually worked 6 days a week from 8 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night when she went to bed. And then quite often he might want me on Sunday too, although he knew that I usually went to church and he usually let me do that. But we developed quite a strong relationship between the two of us because he visited the two of us even after we were married. Elizabeth, his daughter, was in our wedding, and so he often rode. We often had breakfast at the Parkside when he would come back to town after Elizabeth no longer came to Charlevoix. But
Well, the money you made, I think you mentioned, was probably at a higher pay scale than anybody else in town, and you were very frugal with this money, and you saved it and put yourself entirely through school.
that's true. Mr. Joseph was known to be a little bit difficult to work for. And I just put myself in neutral because the money that he paid me at the time was very good. Well, when you divide the number of hours that I worked, it probably wasn't, but at least, I could save the $50 that he paid me a week, and I put it all in my bank account. And when it was time to go to college, I did put myself totally through college, worked while I was going to school also.
There's also the times when you were getting older and you were in a lot of school activities, but your mother taught in Petoskey, and when she came home, she was busy getting dinner on the table,
Milking cows.
helping out on the farm. And I think your parents had to make you understand that if you wanted to participate in these activities, you had to do it yourself. They couldn't taxi you into town night after night. So you ended up walking many times into town and back. How far was that?
5 miles.
And you thought nothing of it.
No, you didn't. I wanted to be in the junior play with you. Actually, you were in the play too. And my mother said, I'm not always going to be able to pick you up. And so, if you want to be in this play, you've got to get yourself home. I would ride the bus and I could stay at my grandpa and grandma Struthers on Upright Street until time for play practice. But, once play practice was over, I had to find a way to get home. And neighbors would sometimes pick me up, and but if they didn't, I just walked home. And 5 miles really isn't all that far. But I think the thing that's hard for people to think about today is that it was dark. And so here I am, in high school, and a pretty small girl, walking home in the dark. But, no one worried about it. It was okay.
That's true. Now, Vince, your family lived another 2 miles beyond the Berg farm.
Right.
And you have stories about your ancestors walking into Charlevoix and back.
Sure.
What were the circumstances for that?
Well, buses didn't always come out there and pick them up. And I can remember my dad telling about his freshman year of high school. Up until 8th grade, he went to the one-room school at Burgess, which is about halfway between the two farms. And then he started high school in Charlevoix. And the first day, he was a little kind of big for his age, and the football coach saw him and asked him to come out for football. So he stayed after school the first day and practiced with the football team. And he got home late, and my grandfather said, "Where have you been?" Of course, you couldn't call home back in those days. "Well, I went out for football." And my grandfather said, "Well, that's fine, but the chores are still out there to be done." And that was the end of football.
So it was one or the other.
But there were times when my grandfather would rent a room in town for my dad to live during the winter when he went to high school. In fact, he roomed with another guy, student by the name of Harry Baker, brother to Sims Baker. I don't know if you know the Baker family. So for a period of time during each winter, he would room in town and go home on weekends because it was just too hard to get back and forth from the farm out there.
So the chores then had to be done by your grandfather?
Right, and there were young kids, and then of course my uncle Addison for a while. Then he was still at home,
I see.
and my dad's next older brother Byron were still at home to help out.
Okay. Now, after high school, Mary Ann, you went to Mott Community College in Flint, I believe,
Yes,
and you got a degree in retailing.
I did.
And then you were actually named Retailer of the Year at one point?
I was. And shortly after I was named Retailer of the Year from the college, I decided that it wasn't a field that I wanted to be in for the rest of my life. And I had kind of resisted the idea of teaching because my dad had been a teacher, my mother was a teacher, my sister was a teacher. I mean, I just wanted to do something different. And I thought retailing sounded really quite glamorous. But when push came to shove, I really didn't like to sell people things that they didn't need or want. So I started thinking that I might want to go into teaching. And so I kind of changed hats and started in a program where when you had 2 or 3 years of college under your belt, you could teach full time, but you had a master teacher over you that supervised you, that had 10 students that she was in charge of, or he was in charge of. In this case, it was all women master teachers. And so when I taught in Flint for 4 years, Helena Schreiner was my master teacher. And at any time that I was teaching, she might sidle into the room, into the back. She'd sit down at one of the desks. She'd watch me teach. And if all of a sudden she felt like she could do something better to demonstrate, she might just walk right up and I'd slide over and she would take over a lesson and demonstrate what she wanted. It was a marvelous program. The teachers that came out of that program were really, I think they had such a good background and so much to draw on from those master teachers giving us support.
Vince, did you go to Mott also?
Yes. Right on, as soon as I graduated, I got a job with the telephone company, Michigan Bell Telephone Company, and then I was going to school nights. And I got an associate degree. It was called Flint Junior College when I went. And after the associate degree, I joined the Marine Corps Ready Reserve program, did 6 months of active duty. And when I came home from that, we got married. And,
It's a cute story of how you met. I mean, here are your families meshing in the background behind you, in that you didn't even know each other until...
Well, it's interesting. Vincent's family often came to the different state parks around our area. And they came to Burt Lake one summer, and his father always came to the Church of God, where I went with my parents when I was growing up. And I sang in the choir, and I saw this cute boy down in the audience, and I thought, oh, I'd really like to meet him. And so after church, of course, Claire, Vincent's dad, was talking to my mother because, they were neighbors and grew up together, and they know, in fact, they even went on a double date at one time together. And I said to my mother, kind of quietly, I said, invite them to dinner. And my mother, being the sport that she was, she could cook any amount of food in a flash. She did invite them for dinner, and that was the first time we met.
So then the rest is history.
The rest is history.
And
I was 15 and he was 16.
she showed me the barn that afternoon.
What a romantic story to a lifelong love story. Okay, so you get married, and then comes the decision. What brought you back to Charlevoix? Did you have any trouble getting back into the Charlevoix school system?
No, absolutely not. At that time, teachers were, so in demand. And when we came back, we applied in Harbor Springs, Petoskey, and Charlevoix. And all 3 schools offered us both teaching positions. And so we decided to, of course, teach in Charlevoix because that's my hometown and I loved it.
What year was it?
1966.
We had been coming up often, all the time that we were going to get, while she was in Flint. Anytime we could manage it, we came back here. We just loved this area and had family here. So it was, and I remember one day being stuck in traffic in downtown Flint and hot fall day, and said, this is, and it was Friday, and we were going to go home and then head north. And of course, in those days before the interstate, everybody else had the same idea, and so there would be a traffic jam until you got at least north of Bay City. And then on Sunday night coming back, it would be the same thing. You would hit that traffic about, somewhere between Clare and Bay City, and it would be stop and go all the way back to Flint. And we would look on the other side of the road where the traffic was sparse, because everybody was doing the same thing we were. And the idea occurred to me that if I taught up in Charlevoix and we wanted to come back and see our friends in Flint, it would be the opposite. We would be in the fast lane. So that was part of the decision.
And so when we did come back, actually Vincent came first, and he was building a house out on the end of Susan Lake. Mm-hmm. And actually that's where Andrew Struthers, the homestead, was there. We bought a lot from my father, but it actually was Struthers' property that our first home was built on. And Vincent had never built anything before, and decided that he would build our house. And he had gone to the library and gotten books on how to build a house. And he built the house out on the south end of Susan Lake. That was our first home that he built, what we built. I did help.
That's amazing.
It's a family tradition. My father did the same thing. My father built a home. He bought a book called The Carpenter's Square and How to Use It. And he followed the book, and he built a home that I lived in for part of my growing up years.
That's amazing. Who would think of doing that today?
But, libraries go way back with us and have been important. Have always been important to us. So.
Well, you became such an esteemed fourth grade teacher in the Charlevoix school system that up here you were named Teacher of the Year one year.
I was named Teacher of the Year.
And now, Vince, you have a story about establishing the first computer educational lab. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. About 1980, there were a few people in couple of people in the high school that had some computer background in mainframe computers and programming, Fortran and COBOL and those high-end languages. But the personal computers started to come in. And the high school decided they were going to go with IBM personal computers, but nobody knew what to do at middle school and elementary level. The school board decided we need to get into technology, and so they went to the public and asked for a millage, and it passed. So suddenly we had $120,000 of millage money come in, and they needed somebody to find out what to do with it. And so I had been the principal, and I'd been principal for 6 years, and it wasn't really my cup of tea. And so I saw this opportunity and left the classroom, or left the administration, went back into the classroom. They sent us to Dallas, Texas, to a conference on how to use computers in education. And we tried out different models of Atari and Radio Shack, and finally ended up going with Apple. And back in those days, the Apple IIe that had the floppy drives and so on. And a little later, Apple came out with a Macintosh, and then a little better version of the Macintosh. And we decided to set up a lab in this building right above us, the room that's directly above us. I bought 32 Mac computers and one high-end Mac for a server. And I spent the summer wiring up a network, Ethernet cables, and I built 2 half walls up the length of the room and ran the wires and put in the plugs and so on for this network. And then that's where I taught for the rest of my teaching career until we retired in '96.
I think you told me that one of your first setups was a Radio Shack, something, and your memory storage was
A tape
On tape?
recorder.
A tape
Yeah,
recorder.
just a plain tape recorder with a little reel in, a cassette tape recorder. It didn't have random access, but it had, you probably have more memory in the remote for your car door than that computer had.
Well, now we will get to really what I have been anticipating up to this point, your roles in the development of the Charlevoix Public Library. And this is very important because I think it is the opinion of a lot of people in Charlevoix that if it hadn't been for you, especially Mary Ann, this building wouldn't exist. So can you give us a run up and then into how the Charlevoix Public Library came into existence, considered to be now one of the finest library facilities in the state of Michigan?
Well, as I said, we've had a passion for libraries forever, it seems like, even growing up as a child. And we became a district library in 1997. And I was on that first library board of trustees and continued for 18 years. And on that board, we decided that we definitely needed more space. The library, the old library on Clinton Street, was so crowded, and we just didn't have room to do anything anymore. In fact, the computers that were coming in were right in the middle of where people were reading. It was very inconvenient. So we started looking for property. That was the first thing we did. And we finally decided after many meetings, a lot of research, that this building would be the best property because it had parking area around it, enough land. And the board also wanted to have the library downtown. And this was the only property in downtown Charlevoix that was large enough to accommodate all of our needs. So the building had been empty for 2-3 years. The school had basically abandoned the building. It was no longer used. We had the new high school, and this building was left empty. So we decided to find out if the building could be renovated. And we had experts come in and tell us that this building was solid, that it would last for another 50 to 100 years.
This was around 2003, 2004,
Yes,
somewhere in there?
Correct. And so with that in mind, we decided that we would try to buy this property. Well, we really didn't have the money. And so we approached, the DDA to try to cover us until we could pass a bond issue and millage. And so for 6 months, we had, before we would vote for this property, if the community would support it with a millage. And we had to sell the idea that we needed a bigger library to this community. So Cynthia Postmas, Kay Heisey, and I, every single Wednesday at the old library in the basement, we had a PowerPoint that we had put together, and we had coffee, tea, and we all baked every week and served homemade goodies. And we would go through our PowerPoint program of why we needed to have a library in Charlevoix. And there was another offer on the table for this property with money on the table to the Board of Education. And the Board of Education, they were good enough to hold the property. They gave us 6 months to come up with the money to buy this building. And so we went through all week long, we would work calling people to come to our coffees
I think
because,
sometimes you had 2 people show up.
oh yes, we didn't always have a large group, but we would try to answer any question. If we didn't know the answer, we would write a letter after we found out the information, and we'd spend the week calling. We'd go down through the phone book, and if we heard of anyone that was opposing a new library, we would try to especially invite them. And
I think the
to
word got
educate.
out on the treats too. People, I think.
Well, Vince, you were involved with service organizations here, and I'm sure Mary Ann took advantage of that by coming to to every service organization they could think of
Oh, we did.
and giving programs.
You know, we went to the Chamber of Commerce and we got a catalog of all of the service organizations and clubs in Charlevoix. And there were like 56 at that time. And we went and we called every single organization and said we had this PowerPoint program that we would do about the library, wanting a new library. So that's kind of the beginning of how we got the millage passed. Once the millage passed, then we involved the whole community and went from there.
They
Well,
did a
that-
very smart thing too. They had a bond issue to build the building and an operating millage.
Yes.
And the deal was that if either one failed, the other one would be no. So both of them passed. They got the bond issue passed to build the building. They're still paying off the bonds. And the operating millage, which is a perpetual millage.
Well, I remember it was no done deal because especially when the issue of the community room came up, there were so many people in town who were opposed to it because they said we didn't need it. But what we had at that time was the auditorium at the high school and a few church basements and maybe some community halls. There was nothing in between for the community's various organizations to meet. And I think this was a hard sell, and the split between yays and nays for the millage, 60-40, somewhere in there.
It passed with, it really passed healthfully. I
Yeah.
can't remember the exact figures that it
But-
was, but
but-
there were people who were opposed to the community room. And actually, there were people that were opposed to having a new library. And
I remember.
it was a hard sell. And that's where kind of my retailing degree came in a little bit. And it got so that people, I think, really crossed the street. They didn't want to talk to me because anyone that I met, I talked about our need for a new library. And twisted a lot of arms.
You should see her operate in the book sale upstairs.
Yes, I have. I can't get a word in edgewise. I remember when it did pass and we had a community room, you told me that you anticipated 2 to 3 events a week in this room. Within 2 months, you were scheduling 2 to 3 events a day. And this is a perfect field of dreams syndrome. If you build it, they will come. And Charlevoix finally realized the need for that community room. And since that time, and I think we should describe to whoever's going to be looking and listening to this, that the community room seats 150, but it can be divided into 2 with a soundproof barrier that comes down from the ceiling. So you can have 2 events going at the same time, and they can't hear each other. Since 2006, I believe there have been several thousand events
Oh, yes.
in that room. That the city didn't even realize it needed that space. I remember one of the ironic things, your colleague, Kay Heisey, gave a program for the Historical Society on the history of the library, the entire history of the school, or the library system in Charlevoix. She waited too long to book the community room in the library, which is the logical place for it, because it was already booked on the night she needed, so we had to do it at the depot.
Yes, if you want to use the community room, you need to book it well in advance
Months
because
in
it is
advance.
it's often in use, several times
As
a
not,
day. And-
not only the community room, but the trustees' room and the Armstrong room, the meeting rooms upstairs, even the study rooms, they're
The study
just
rooms.
used constantly.
Yes, it was because the only 2 additions that were put on this building was the children's activity room and then the community room with the art exhibit area outside, which is used constantly also. The exhibit there changes monthly, and you have to schedule your exhibit, whatever you want to exhibit, months in advance.
Well, what amazed me about the children's room, excuse me, at the end of the children's wing is you can close those doors and those kids can be in there screaming their heads off. Now, this is a library building, and they can't be heard anywhere else.
Yes.
So that gets me into the question of who did you choose to have the library designed?
Okay, Ingrid Anderson was the designer, and then we had Clark Construction was the builder. And Alice Riemann Snyder was the interior designer.
When I was teaching in this building, there were 17 different levels.
Yes.
You had to go up a few steps to get to the boys' or girls' bathrooms. You had to go up 3 steps to get to the gym, and then down to the cafeteria. And there were class space in the basement. There were 17 different levels. So in order to convert this into a handicap accessible building that it is today, they took everything out, clear down to the basement floor, left just the walls, took the roof off and everything. And then they started bringing in dirt and compacting it and bringing it all up to the grade level of compacted dirt. So now everything is on 2 levels with an elevator, so it's handicap accessible, except for the one little space, the mezzanine. But basically everything in the building is handicap accessible now.
And kind of interesting, the fireplace was saved, and there were, large equipment moving around in the tractors and things going around in the library with the dirt on the floor when they were changing the 17 levels or 16 levels. But anyway, this fireplace had been covered with cardboard to protect it. And we wanted the windows to look like the original building. And so the windows didn't come in, and they didn't come in on time, and November rolled around, and the mist and the rain and things was, things were being affected because the windows didn't come. So Cynthia Postmus and I came down, and we wanted to check on this fireplace and the Batchelder tile that it was built with. But anyway, we lifted the cardboard up because we were stepping around in dirt in here, and the wind was blowing, and it was freezing in here and damp. And I said, Cynthia, the surface of the tiles is curling up. And lo and behold, we looked, well, we didn't realize that it had been painted over the Batchelder tiles. So we had to come up with money then to restore that. Alice Riemann Snyder had designed this whole Belvedere room around the colors in that fireplace that she saw when it was painted. None of us realized what had happened. And so that all had to be removed, and we were worried that all the colors and everything that had been chosen for this room wouldn't work. But as it turned out, it did, and the fireplace is beautiful. It was restored beautifully. And,
Can you give our viewers a little rundown on what Batchelder tiles are?
Well, Pewabic tiles you've probably heard of, and most people have. It's kind of the same caliber of tiles that were from the early 1900s, and they're very collectible. With that thought in mind, we also had a fish pond that's on the wall over here in the historic photo.
I'm practically sitting in the fish
Yes,
pond right here.
you are. And it was quite large, and there was water fish and a little fountain in the center with a fish with the water flowing. And that was the same tile, and unfortunately that was, torn out. And this is what it looked like right here. And these are a morning and afternoon kindergarten class. And you see the bench on the window. Well, we also tried to duplicate the bench. We wanted a bench in this room, the Belvedere room. And so...
Hold on to that picture here. I want to point out this little girl right here. Her name is Roseanne Herrick, and her father was brought to Charlevoix from Monroe as city manager, and he is the one who got our city hall constructed in 1939. But when she was 2.5, 3 years old, downstate, she was tested for IQ and found to have the highest IQ of any child in the United States that had been tested to that time.
Oh my goodness.
So she's still alive. She lives in Virginia. She's a lovely woman. And I asked her, what did you do with this tremendous gift that you have? And she said, we were approached by Hollywood. Now there is a picture in our files of her with Jimmy Cagney and Betty Davis. Her parents were smart enough to realize what would happen to a child of her caliber and sensitivity if she ever got out to Hollywood. So they said absolutely no. So she ended up getting a PhD in educating advanced special children herself.
That's exciting. Now, does she come back to Charlevoix and
Yes,
visit?
she still has relatives here.
And do you know if she has visited the library and seen her
Oh,
picture
yes.
on the wall? Good.
Yes, she has. So, on a personal note, you and I go back to this room
We do.
71 years ago.
David,
We
did you
were
really
in-
need to make it that?
We were in kindergarten.
You're in trouble now, David.
We were in kindergarten in this room from 1945 to 1946, and in the rest of the building up until the end of, seventh grade?
Yes.
Well, I didn't go to school with you guys, but from the time I was still in high school, I would, everywhere you guys went, I would, like when your band made trips down to Lansing and so on, I went over there and listened to you at Band Festival. I've been to all of your school reunion, class reunions. I've never gone to one of mine. Of course, I had 720 in my graduating class. And so I've kind of turned my back on that. And I think you had 50 in your class.
50.
So I know most of them. And in fact, we're heading out to California tomorrow, and we're going to have dinner with another of your classmates out in San Francisco Saturday
We'll see.
night.
Ed and Susan.
Ed O'Neill, yeah.
Now-
And his wife Susan works here some
Right,
when they're here in
right.
Charlevoix.
Now, it's
in the
interesting that you
library.
should bring this topic up because Marianne and I come from a class that still we keep in tabs with everybody that we have ever gone to school with. Whenever anybody comes to town, we have another classmate, Mary Janice Supernall, who we call the class mother hen. And she sends out on the electronic tom-tom, we got to get together, somebody's coming into town, and we all try to get together in some form or another for breakfast, for coffee, maybe lunch, maybe dinner. And we keep in contact with each other, and we're concerned about each other. It's like an extension of the family.
Yeah, that's
that
the
we have
nice
kept-
thing about a small
we
class
have
like
kept
that. I
this
think.
friendship going for 7 decades now.
Well, it's like with Larry Smith, who was one of our classmates and was editor of the Parade magazine and, wrote all these books, was on the bestseller list. And when we needed a program here at the library, he did it, for us free. And it was nice to see him. And he's still Larry, the Larry that we went to school with.
And the amazing thing about it, when we get together, there's no hesitation. We pick up where we left off.
Sure.
I think if we left off in the middle of a sentence, if we got back together, we would finish the sentence and then go on from there.
It is.
So there's a very strong bond that is formed, and it's not only our class, it's a lot of the other classes that have gone through the Charlevoix school system. So I don't know if it's in the drinking water. I don't know.
Well,
if it's,
change the subject a little bit. We can go back up a little bit. When we came here in '66, I came up. First of all, I borrowed my dad's car and trailer and came up with a tent and camping equipment. And I camped on our lot on Susan Lake. And she stayed in Flint to teach summer school. And my dad, of course, took the car and trailer back, and I had a motorcycle. My first week in town, my first trip to town, because I had to drive into Kit Carson Lumber and order material and have it delivered because I didn't have any way to pick things up. So my first trip to town, I got a speeding ticket on my motorcycle, had my name in the paper. The future teacher got a speeding ticket. And so I lived in a tent. I had a wooden kayak that my dad had built that he let me have on the lake there. And at the end of the day, I'd be hot and sweaty, and I'd paddle out into Susan Lake, and I'd lather up and then dive in, and then climb back on the kayak. Marianne came up then after she was finished summer school, and we lived in the tent. We kept our milk and butter and cheese and so on in a spring, natural spring that was over across the Boyne City Road, where over that was part of her dad's farm also. And so we got the roof on and pretty much enclosed by the time school started, but it wasn't drywalled or anything. So we were living in this unfinished house. We enclosed one bedroom. I put sheathing all the way around the interior walls and insulated it. And we lived in the one bedroom because there was no heat in the rest of the house, and used a space heater. And then we kept working on the house and finished it. That was the first one. And since that time, I've built a lot of houses. When school started, I met Connie Drury. Connie was a sixth grade teacher, and he had built his own house also on 31 South. And he came out, I was ready to put my furnace and duct work in, and Connie came out and helped me, and we found out we both liked building together. And so for subsequent summers, for about 25 years, all summer we would build. We both ended up getting residential builders licenses so that we could get jobs for other people. And I sold that house in 1974 and built a house on Cherry Street. And then in 1980, Mary Ann saw the lot where we live now, and she really thought it was a nice lot. We bought it, and I started another house. I had it almost finished when school started in 1980, and I put both houses up for sale. Whichever one sold, we would live in the other one. Well, I sold the house on Cherry Street sold, and so we went ahead and finished the one on Beechwood, where we live now in the township, Charlevoix Township. And
So how many houses do you build in all, do you know?
oh, I would say at least 20 complete houses, and lots of garages and decks and
Kitchens?
remodeling interiors and that sort of thing. I doubt if I could list them all. There've been so many over the years that.
And you educated yourself in doing this?
Well, of course, I
Pretty
learned on my own, the first house that I built out on Susan Lake. I had got a lot of good advice from the guys at the lumber yards, Charlevoix Lumber and Kit Carson Lumber. And you'd ask them, find out how guys were doing things and what materials were the most popular and seemed to work the best. And one interesting thing on the house in Susan Lake, I did everything. I formed the footings and had the concrete truck come out and poured the footings with no help. I laid the block myself. She came up then and was my mason tender. So she would mix the mortar, and then she would slide the blocks down a little ramp that I made to me down in the basement. And I also put my well down by hand. Her father, having been a well driller, knew about putting wells down by hand. So he got a drive point and 20 feet of pipe for me, and what is called a light driver, which it wasn't light at all. And so I started in the basement before I had the basement floor in. And so I had about a 7-foot head start. I had to build a 20-foot high scaffolding and then climb up the top, and there was a cap in the top of the pipe with a hole in it that a rod went through, and a piston was fastened to the bottom of the rod, and then the other end of the rod was fastened to a big weight with handles on it. So I would lay a few courses of block, and then it would climb up the scaffold, and I would start lifting the driver up and slamming it down, lift it up and slam it down until I drove all 20 feet plus the 4-foot drive point down to the basement floor level. And then I added another section of pipe and kept going. Well,
How far did you have to go to get water?
finally ended up, I think, got good water at 35 feet below the basement floor. The worst part of it was that we didn't know if we'd get good water. My father-in-law got a used drive point that had a hole in the screen wasn't intact. And so when I got it all down and my father-in-law brought over a pump to try it out and knew we had good water, I had to lift it all out. And you did the same thing in reverse. You had this cap and the piston then would slam up. So I had to slam that weight up. Well, it came out pretty easy. But then I thought, now when I put it back down the same hole, it should go really easy. It was worse the second time. But I got it down the second time with a new drive point on it.
And you finally got your water supply.
Yeah, it was pretty hard water. We had to have a water softener, but it was good. It was tasty water, good water.
Well, good. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you both so much. Do you have anything you want to add?
The only thing I would like to add was it's a delight every day to come into this library. Absolutely love it. And at the time we were working so hard to build the library and include the community in every aspect of building the library, I thought that I was doing it, for the community. But guess what? It's really for me too, because I use it every day and love it, and I love to be here. So it's, it's gone full circle, hasn't it? From kindergarten, starting here, coming to this school then that was so wonderful with a playhouse, a fireplace, bathrooms that had the facilities. The toilet was, a foot high? Then going through the school, then teaching here, and then coming back as a board member, this building just has wonderful memories for me.
Well, it certainly does. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, it probably wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for your tenacious desire to have it here.
Well, I was a little part of it, but I love the library.
Right. Well, thank you again so much.
Oh, and it was so nice to visit David with an old friend.
I think we could probably go on for another 2 hours.
We probably could.